Hi, welcome everyone. Thank you for venturing out on this snowy evening, and I hope everyone has a safe travel home. My name is Abby Groth. I'm the Assistant Curator of Public Programs here at Sheldon. Very excited that you've all joined us this evening, and a special welcome and hello to all of us who are tuned in to our live stream this evening. I'm very pleased to introduce tonight's panel, a diverse menu, race, gender, class, and the things we eat. We're very fortunate to be joined this evening by author Ijeoma Oluo, restaurant critic Soleil Ho, and our moderator for this evening, Dr. Casey Kelly. You might be wondering how this particular group of people ended up being brought together to talk about food at an art museum. Museums have increasingly become places to not just look at pretty pictures, although we certainly do this, and with good reason, but to gather, to reflect, to have conversation. As an academic art museum on a university campus, we believe that our charge is to create opportunities for conversation and critical inquiry around any number of disciplines, be they aesthetic, to intellectual, to social, to scientific, and everything in between. Our current exhibition, Table Manners, Art and Food, takes a broad look at the ways in which artists have engaged with food in their work, commenting on social issues, cultural values, or political agendas. Our goal with tonight's program is to expand upon the ideas taken up by the artists in Table Manners and provide a contemporary context for some of the ways to think about food, especially as it relates to how our society conceptualizes race, gender, and class. This is central to our belief at Sheldon that providing robust cross-disciplinary programming helps position the museum as a nexus where the sharing of diverse perspectives is sought after and celebrated. Before we get started, I'd like to draw your attention to two items you received when you arrived. The first is a blank note card. We'll be moderating our question and answer from the stage tonight, so as the panel proceeds, write your questions down on the cards, and we'll collect them at the end of the discussion and present them to the panelists from the stage. The second item is a short feedback form. We would really appreciate hearing about what you liked or didn't like about tonight's program. This helps us determine what sorts of programming we should pursue in the future. So thank you in advance for your help with this endeavor. Lastly, I'd like to thank those who have given their generous support to this exhibition, including Roseanne and Phil Perry, Kathy and Mark LeBaron, Lisa and Tom Smith, Security, First Bank, and Hickson Lead Endowment. And I'd also like to thank members of the Sheldon Art Association for their continual support of museum programming. And now I'm very pleased to introduce our moderator for this evening, Dr. Casey Kelly, Associate Professor of Rhetoric and Public Culture in the Communication Studies Department. Dr. Kelly's research investigates cultural proxy wars concerning gender, race, and nationalism, including food and globalization, hegemonic masculinity, sexuality and film, pop culture and neocolonialism, and indigenous self-determination, and I'm sure a lot of other things as well. He is author of Abstinent Cinema, Virginity and the Rhetoric of Sexual Purity in Contemporary Film, Food, Television and Otherness in an Age of Globalization, and co-editor of Decolonizing Native American Rhetoric. His work has appeared in many scholarly journals, including Quarterly Journal of Speech and Communication and Critical Cultural Studies. In 2018, Dr. Kelly was awarded the National Communication Association's Carl R. Wallace Memorial Award, and in 2017, he was awarded the NCA's Rhetorical and Communication Theory Division's Early Career Award. So I'll now hand over the mic to Dr. Kelly, who will introduce our two panelists, but first, please join me in giving a hearty welcome to all our participants.
Welcome to a diverse menu, race, gender, class, and the things we eat. A conversation with Ijeoma Oluo and Soleil Ho. I am honored to host such well-respected public intellectuals. I'll start by giving a little bit more of information about our guests tonight. Ijeoma is author of So You Want to Talk About Race and was named one of the Root's 100 most influential African Americans in 2017 and winner of the 2018 Feminist Humanist Award by the American Humanist Society. Oluo was also named one of the most influential people in Seattle by Seattle Magazine and one of 50 most influential women in Seattle by Seattle Met. Her writing has been featured in The Washington Post, NBC News, Elle Magazine, Time, The Stranger, and The Guardian, among many other outlets. Her work primarily focuses on issues of race and identity, feminism, social and mental health, social justice, and the arts. Next, we have Soleil Ho, restaurant critic for the San Francisco Chronicle and producer of the podcast Racist Sandwich. As a trained chef, Soleil has worked from restaurants in New Orleans and Minneapolis. In 2018, she received the Southern Foodways Alliance Smith Symposium Fellowship and a UC Berkeley 11th Hour Food and Farming Journalism Fellowship. Her writing has been published by The New Yorker, GQ, Eater, Taste, and Bitch Media, among others. Ho is also the author of graphic novel Meal. Ho's work engages the intersections between what we consume and how we see ourselves and our world. To begin, I'm going to ask a series of questions and open it up to a conversation with our guests for this evening. The first one begins with the work that Ijeoma has done in So You Want to Talk About Race. In the book, she argues that our definitions of racism must account for the broader structures of power and that support and are supported by everyday racism. Bridging this insight with Soleil's published work, as well as her work on the Racist Sandwich podcast, I want to ask our participants to consider what might that conversation look like in the context of food. For instance, how do our food, agriculture, and restaurant industries participate in and support structural racism? Here I'm thinking about problems such as food deserts and food access, dollar stores replacing grocery stores in low-income communities, lack of minority ownership in food industries, regulation of EBT benefits, exploitation of immigrant labor in the field, in the kitchen, and so forth. Most importantly, what can and should be done about the racial inequalities in our food system and our food culture?
Oh man, it's such a
It's
big
a lot.
question.
Yeah.
I know. I mean, as you put it, right? Food is just inherently political because it is a thing that exists in this world, which it doesn't make any sense when I say it like that. But to me, that's what makes it political. There's so many things that lead up to us, like to the moment in which we consume something. You think about labor politics, gender politics, race politics, geopolitics, and so. I guess to kind of give a really shallow, beginning shot of an answer, I think that, when you think about fertile politics, there's so many things rolled up into the single kind of bite, the single thing that you have that it's a fertile jumping off point to talk about all of these bigger things. And it's so accessible to everyone because everyone eats food, probably. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say too, food is a finite resource, and any finite resource in a capitalist system is going to be exploited by a capitalist system, and race is also a product of a capitalist system, race as we know it. And so they are going to intertwine, and any time that there are resources of limited means, resources that can be commodified, that can have a price, that price is often going to, like many other things, seek to benefit those on top and exploit those on the bottom. Mm-hmm. So we have a lot of issues today. Our food is absolutely ingrained in race and how we think about race, even if we're talking about issues of immigration and who's helping produce our food. Mm-hmm. When we talk about issues of freedom and who gets to choose what they eat and who doesn't, who has access to healthy food and who doesn't. Even simple, I was talking with, locally where I live in Seattle, we have a huge debate over building a new youth detention center. And just noticing things that our juvenile detention center, our alternative high schools, and our prisons all have food made by the same company that often also times exploits prison labor, and that's primarily people of color, kids of color, in the same pipeline that includes just the basic lack of a decent meal while you're also being dehumanized in so many other ways. And how often, and the fact that oftentimes it's prisoners of color who are forced to participate in this system of further harming young people of color who are just being introduced into this harmful system. So there are so many different ways in which food, even talking beyond many of the things that we talk about in the news about exploitation and things like that of, certain indigenous dishes or things like that, even the process of creating our food and marketing our food and selling our food ends up falling in this system of racial exploitation and oppression.
Mm-hmm.
And what I find really fascinating about it, about food as a political entity, is the way we consume food media is so wrapped up in appearances and the final product, and just when you think about Instagram, and just all you see is the plate, right? And that's kind of how we consume new foods, new ideas about food, is just the final product without any sort of context. And the work that I do is an attempt to bring that context back, because there's so many deep stories and so many just huge issues inherent in it. But if we disconnect the product from those stories, then we just become a purely consumptive, meaningless culture, which is so dramatic. But I think if you don't, then what difference does one plate have against another plate? What meaning is there?
But I think it also really depends on the food itself, because that also falls within hierarchies of the patriarchy and white supremacy, right? Because certain food is revered, right? And your Michelin chefs that are primarily helmed by white men, all of the focus is on the process and the work, and how people even assume that it's much harder to make than it is. But work that's primarily done by people of color or by women, that sort of food work is simplified. It's turned into this drudgery or this adventure that you're supposed to only pay a couple of bucks for. Those are your cheap eats. And so even that ends up falling in these harmful patterns. There are so many people who spend, you're a chef or you're a home cook. Right? And even people who work in restaurants somehow don't get to be called a chef unless they are kind of working in this Anglo-male environment and doing this sort of style of cooking, even though there are plenty of, even those simple ways in which families in the Midwest are cooking are oftentimes far more complicated than a lot of chefs in restaurants are cooking. And I think that, it's interesting to see the oversimplification that I find a lot on social media are for a lot of dishes that are oftentimes overlooked, a lot of culturally significant dishes for cultures that are non-white, but there's very few we're going to learn how to make coq au vin in 5 minutes, right? That's not a thing that you find on the Instagram stories, but it will be how to make this incredibly complicated Thai dish in 5 minutes, and cutting every corner, and it's kind of this general lack of respect and divorcing people from the process.
Mm-hmm. And when you mention cheap eats, that is just everything, right, about this. When you think about, for instance, just restaurants that are primarily owned by people of color or in communities of color, people will go to these restaurants, like maybe a taqueria, right, and they say oh, this taco is perfect, it's $1 per taco, that's the best. And then, when a Mexican chef attempts to open a restaurant and charge $12 for the taco and pay their workers living wages and buy ingredients that are local, organic, whatever, people complain, right? So there's all this complication to whose labor deserves to be paid more and whose labor can just be considered an externality to the price of the food.
And of course, a fusion chef could open up their own version of tacos that don't look like tacos and charge $20 a taco, and people will line up to buy it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and related to the home cooking thing too, the binary is so fascinating. And what I find really interesting is one of the big cookbooks of this past year was on fermentation by René Redzepi and the team at Noma, this really lauded, internationally known restaurant in Denmark. And he's a super famous chef, right? And the idea behind the book about fermentation was introducing fermentation to the home kitchen. And to me, that just seems so weird, right? Isn't that where most fermentation has taken place around the world, right? People who cook at home, burying pots of kimchi in their backyards, and people making sauerkraut in the basement. That's
made pickles.
Yeah, it's a normal thing that people do. But when you chefify it, you can sell a book for $40 on it.
Right. And some of those foods are also foods that are produced out of necessity, that have become glorified in some ways because perhaps a white chef picked it up and sold it as a sort of upper class cuisine. Kind of interesting.
Yeah, I saw there was a feature on New York Times on Kool-Aid pickles, and I was just y'all are kidding me, right?
Right.
Kool-Aid, first off, Kool-Aid pickles are gross. But they're also like a necessity when you're a kid, man. They're sweet, they're salty, they're cool, they're really cheap because a shop owner can just pour a packet of Kool-Aid and a jar of pickles. It's a real staple in a lot of areas of the Black community and in the Southern community. And suddenly New York Times is like, ooh, check out these Kool-Aid pickles. And we're like, y'all don't need to stain your fingers like that. Like that was an affordable snack. It's not anything. I don't know anyone like from my community that was looking to take that to make a thing. But also like I really hope that there's some like gentrifiers out there paying $12 for a Kool-Aid pickle. I really hope so.
Yeah, hopefully they're getting paid. Yeah, they're getting paid for it. Yeah,
Yeah, because other people haven't been. So.
yeah, I know, exactly. Yeah. So let me move on to another topic that I think a lot of people are probably interested in, which is the topic of cultural appropriation. Still a topic that we have to talk about. And both of you devoted some attention in your work to this concept, the adoption or exploitation of another culture by a dominant culture, what Bell Hooks has called eating the other, desiring the other. For instance, Ijeoma talks about the dispiriting experience in her book, finding an African restaurant in the airport that had no Ethiopian or Nigerian cuisine, but instead zebra prints and cave drawings on the wall. Soleil has also highlighted her own experience as well, as interviewed a number of chefs of color who note the problematic nature of white chefs being celebrated for their use of exotic ingredients, fusion cuisines, and so forth. How do we promote appreciation for diverse experiences and cultural practices without engaging in exploitation? No pressure.
I would say, first of all, it starts with appreciating the creators and the producers. And so often we try to skip past that. Like people find this thing, they like it, they go to a restaurant, they're like, oh, I want to make my version of this. They don't stop and think, I really appreciate the person that made this, and I appreciate the culture that made this and sustains this. And that looks different because when you do that, then you're actually seeking out that art form and you're seeking out the people that do it and you want them to continue to do it and you invest in them. I always have, when I find like a really great restaurant that I can tell is being made by people who grew up loving this food and like you can feel the history in the food, I'm immediately like desperate to make sure that people are coming to it and eating there so that it can stay. My thought isn't, how can I learn to make this and make my own version of this, right? And I think like appreciation looks different. When you appreciate something, you appreciate everything that created it and sustains it, and you invest in that. And when it comes to food, a lot of times what people want is, they don't want to stretch or learn or maybe sit with the harder to immediately digest parts of it, whether that's the history, the culture, or even just certain ingredients, and to appreciate the entire thing. They want to fast forward and put it through their own cultural lens so that it's immediately digestible. And that isn't what respect looks like, and that's not what care looks like, and it's not sustainable, and it's just a quick way to actually divorce food from what it was and divorce it from the culture that sustains it. And we've even seen issues where an ingredient that was long disdained suddenly becomes popular, and then the culture that created it can't afford it anymore. Yeah. And it's not sustainable then, and basically what we're doing is just destroying, and we have to, that's not what love looks like, that's not what respect looks like. And I think that a lot of times when we look at this, so often when people come to me and they're like, how can I not do this? They're not actually coming from a place of real respect and love, because their question is how can I have this? How can I make this mine? And not how can I make sure this continues? How can I make sure this grows? How can I give back for what it's given me? And that's what love and respect looks like. And so I think oftentimes when people are even asking that question, I think it's really easy to know how to love and respect something. It's the same way we love and respect other people, right? We don't come up and say, I love you and you're mine and I want to take all your best things and nothing else and discard you when you're an empty husk of yourself. It's the same for any other cultural product too. You want it to sustain, and everyone that I love, everything that I love, I try to think of how to sustain it and how to grow it and how to invest in it. And you love it for what it is and not what it is to you, not how it can, be useful for you in that moment. And we need to look at food the same way. Yeah.
And I think money is such an important part of this too, because it's not love to commodify something and just strip it of its context again. Like it doesn't make sense outside of its context unless you introduce your own story and like talk more about why it matters and why the people who made it matter. Because that's interesting. That is actually doing your part to credit people, right? Like it is an intellectual property sort of thing too. And so often when people ask me this question, because I get it a lot as well, I essentially just follow the money. Who's getting paid? Who's materially like benefiting from this endeavor? Are you paying purveyors from Mexico at this, like, you know, when you're saying that you're offering this authentic Mexican experience or food experience? Are you employing people from that community? You know, are you actually a part of that community in some meaningful way? Because oftentimes the story that I see in restaurants, because I go to a lot of restaurants, I read a lot of websites and bios and all that stuff, is that, you know, this chef went to, let's say, Burma on vacation on their honeymoon and then ate this one thing and then came back and now wants to serve it to you. And so like they were there for a week and now they want to make money off of this thing, you know? Whereas people who are from there, who have lived almost their entire lives there, aren't in the position to charge that amount of money, aren't in the position to actually, you know, benefit as much from that. And so the value there just makes no sense. But of course it makes sense within white supremacy and exploitative like settler colonialism. Like we're used to that. We're used to privileging those sorts of aesthetics and points of view in pretty much, when we talk about cultural products from other people.
Yeah. It seems that we're also very disconnected from our food sources too. That makes it easy for us to kind of cut off. It's easy to not follow the money. It's easy to not see how we're reliant and dependent on a whole chain of labor that happens some other place, like it happens in agriculture in the Southwest, and we don't see where it comes from too.
Even the labor in the kitchen, we're totally disconnected from, right? And oftentimes, you know, what's funny too is a lot of times, not funny haha, but like funny gross is, you know, a lot of times you'll have these head chefs that are exploiting a culture, and then it's the people who are doing the prep work that are actually from the culture that are completely treated as disposable and working in really tough conditions, that, you know, or the people selling the raw materials that are constantly being undercut as these prices are dropping, and no one cares, and people will look at it and the chef will get all the acclaim for their ability to bring this thing without looking at all of the labor that was pulled from it. And it's not to be like chefs are evil out there, but the truth is that it is really hard to survive in the restaurant business. And if you are surviving, chances are there's a huge amount of privilege behind that survival, and you really do have to look at all of the people and the entire culture that's kind of behind it, and at whose expense you get to have this space and other people don't. And especially if your work exploits and uses another culture that would not have access to that space, that would not have access to that capital, that wouldn't have access to those reviews and that press and all of those things that make it sustainable in the business. Like that's really, you know, something that needs to be looked at. And it is something that as long as you play into it and you're not being cognizant and doing something to rectify it, that you're responsible for.
Yeah. And a lot of times the critique that I get for my work is that it's just food. Nothing else matters, right? Why are you politicizing food? Because I just want to eat a burrito in peace, right? But, you know, and I get it. I get that seeing the whole story and asking the questions doesn't make you happier. But at the same time, how do you make the world more equitable? How do you take those first steps into having a greater consciousness of like what goes around you and at whose expense do you derive pleasure in this world? I think those are important questions to ask, you know, to sit down with your ethics and figure it out and maybe ask those questions. And starting with food is so easy because you can ask that of anything in front of you. Where does this water come from, right? Where's the plastic in this water come from? Where's it gonna go? You just start. And, you know, I think people ask the question of cultural appropriation versus appreciation a lot because they want those, you know, recommendations, right? They want the permission, like you were saying before when we talked about this. But the problems are so much deeper than that, and I think also so much more interesting. Because, I mean, no one's gonna stone you in the street, right, for wearing traditional Chinese dresses or, you know, I don't even know, eating a burrito without anyone's permission. But, you know, just do this for yourself so you can be a better person in society.
Well, and also, I mean, I think, you know, like we're talking kind of I think even now we're on the bougie end of the spectrum of talking about food, but the truth is like you die without food, and people are dying without food.
Yes.
And a lot of the decisions we make around food, around farming, around agriculture, around our consumption drastically limits the access to food that other people have. And so it becomes even more political than just what it means culturally to steal a recipe and put it out there. We're also talking about the fact that, that pregnant mothers of color are losing pregnancies in part due to lack of proper access to proper nutrition. The fact that, prisoners are being punished by lack of nutrition, and that, children are suffering in school due to lack of adequate nutrition. And we literally have conflicts and wars breaking out all over the world due to shortages of food and food supply and cattle grazing land and all of these things that kind of tie into the consumption choices that we are privileged enough to get to make. And so, food is nothing will ever be just food, because we literally die without it. And so, and because it is something that is so inherent to life, every time that we eat, we are affirming life. And so if every time you eat, that decision is stripped from you, it's taken, all the dignity is taken from it, all of the care is taken from it, the actual sustainability of it's taken from you, the nutrients are taken from you, it is literally taking your life, and it is literally saying something about what your life is worth. And so it's political in a way that many of our other consumption choices won't be. Yeah. And every day that you sit down and eat and you feel blessed and you feel safe and you feel warm, recognize that that's an affirmation of your humanity that is often denied other people. And our decisions on how we eat and what we buy often influence that.
Mm-hmm. On the flip side, that's why control over food supplies is so amazing and also terrible in this world, right? Food sovereignty is so important to so many political struggles, from Palestine, right, and their own control over their own foodways out there, to just people in Oakland, where I live, and their access to just proper grocery stores and fresh produce, and how it's so different from, but it's just barely a couple miles away from the home of the sustainable food movement, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and I love that sustainable food movement when you can afford, to pay whole food prices every day. And sustainable means very different things, I think, to different people.
You see Whole Foods move into one neighborhood, and then you see a dollar store replace a local grocery store in another neighborhood.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
And this is such a tangent, I'm so sorry. But, when we talk about the sustainable food movement, especially in Berkeley, so little of our rhetoric about farm to table and modern food sovereignty and organic and all that stuff even takes into account the fact that these farms and that land is on indigenous land that's been stolen, right? And so we need to have this conversation about sustainable food because we've destroyed the food system that was already here and already figured out by being colonizers. And so there's so many layers to these conversations. You just could talk about this forever, which is what I do.
Yeah, we put boundaries and borders between pre-existing ecosystems that used to sustainably support life. And, so,
and we destroy traditional food sources if they aren't profitable at the time, or if they don't tie the people to a certain entity, and being West African, of course, that's the story of Nigeria, right, of destroying the entire groundnut agriculture in order to tie people to oil money. Right, and now everything is beholden to oil and the corruption of oil, and there is no really sustainable agricultural movement there, and people are starving in one of the most resource-rich countries in Africa because that was all destroyed. And a lot of times we make a lot of decisions and we participate in a lot of decisions for Central America and South America, where entire crops are destroyed to make room for something that's more profitable, because before that was just sustainable for the people, but not for people in power. And then we turn around and we want to know why we have these migration issues and why we have all these other issues where people are desperate to eat and survive and to make a living and to feed their families, And it's because people who have money and power will destroy anything, you know, for whatever fancies them at the time. And we don't think about those long-term consequences. And oftentimes when it comes to natural resources, food is the first thing sacrificed for whatever mineral, whatever other resource can be found there. Sometimes for even that one food, but just so it can be shipped out, you know? And so, you know, it's really something that self-sustainability, I think, in marginalized population, especially when it comes to food, has always kind of been a threat to the powers that be. It's a luxury for wealthy people. And I know I have a lot of, like, I live in Seattle, so I have a lot of white friends who have, like, bee hives in their yard now, because they're like, I'm gonna make my own bees, you know, and so they can have, like, their own fresh honey or whatever. And it becomes a thing that you become wealthy enough to do, to have your own backyard garden and to have these things that used to traditionally be like how marginalized cultures survived. But that's all a threat to big food industries. That's all a threat to whatever natural resources in the area. And so that gets destroyed. And now it's the cool thing to have your own organic and locally grown everything, but only if you can afford it.
Grow your own, you have your own chickens and
Right.
urban homesteading, right?
Yeah. And then you turn around, and then like people with power turn around and they ask, like, why are people in these impoverished communities just eating Doritos, right? And like they were put in that position of dependence and just like not having any options whatsoever.
Cheap
and you
calories.
get to, exactly.
Yeah.
All of this sort of the cycle of shame and then, you know, empowerment is so fascinating to watch. Like when you look at the history and understand why things are the way they are, especially, you know, why people eat the way they do, and all of the sort of like movements and power struggles that led up to that. It's just, it's quite a rabbit hole.
Yeah. Well, let me switch gears to another question, one that asks us to think about the relationship between food, pride, and identity. Soleil, in your podcast, you've talked a lot about how food and food rituals can be important sources of pride, identity, and community, but also at the same time markers of difference and power. For instance, the labeling of Asian, African, and South American ingredients as exotic or bizarre or other, or worse, even considered gross or repulsive or dirty. This is the kind of racial difference that gets articulated as something that's tactile, sensory, olfactory. The question of why does your house not smell like my house seems to be one that I've heard before. And so I was wondering if you could talk about the relationship between food and community and pride and identity, but also coming back to questions of how it's also implicated in white privilege and kind of common sense racism that doesn't seem to be consciously registered by some people.
I guess I'll start by saying I've been mulling over a piece to write for the Chronicle about words, just word choice in food writing and in my own writing. There are some words that I won't use when I write about food. Things like you said, exotic, ethnic, which, you know, has all sorts of things. And it's such a part of the way we talk about food too, and restaurants. Like, oh yeah, there's a bunch of ethnic restaurants in this neighborhood. But what does that mean, right? Don't we all have ethnicities? It's just, and so down to word choice, like the banality of like those words that you use to describe a dish in front of you. You know, they're all inscribed with so much meaning. Like smelly, right? Stinky. Gosh, there's so many other ones, but my list just kept growing and growing and growing and growing. Like slutty, people use to talk about food. Have you heard this? That's just, right. I think, you know, we can talk about that word too, but like I don't really know why that's okay. Just like when you think about like what kind of food that signifies to, I just don't really get it. But and then, so yeah, as a food writer, as a restaurant critic, I feel like that is one of my sources of power, right? Is just changing the way I talk about food and just using that as a baseline, or hopefully modeling that for other people, right? Not using the word authentic unless I'm dismantling it actively in my writing, because it makes, you know, it doesn't work when you talk about restaurants. It reinforces white supremacy and like ideas about cultures that are just sort of fixed and not able to change, because there is some like true form of it that you're referring to with your menu and with your aesthetic. Like, for example, you call a particular Chinese restaurant really authentic. But what does that mean? Does it mean it's been airlifted out of Shanghai and like brought to Lincoln, Nebraska? Does it mean that they just have Chinese characters on the walls? Does it mean they don't speak English? Does it mean they have dishes on the menu that you've never seen before? Or does it mean it just, it's full of Chinese people who are just different? So that's at least my starting point.
I think it's also really important to recognize the white default in the way in which we talk about things. There's this idea that there's normal and then there's other.
Spicy.
And like white food. And I would love like people to actually call white food, right? Because we talk about black food, we talk about black Southern food, we talk about, Chinese food. We don't say this is white food. My mom is a white woman from Kansas, and I have eaten some white food. And it is distinctly white food. I've had the Jell-O casseroles, I've had the milk toast. I mean, it's not what I would call great, but it's so white. Like, there's no one eating this and going, it's distinctly white. In a way that, like, I've had other friends of color who were like, have you ever had this weird Jell-O salad thing with like, there's cottage cheese inside of it and pineapple? I'm like, oh yeah, my mom's white, and they're like, oh, so this is a white thing? Yeah, no, it's very white, and it's a cuisine. And some of it's great. I actually really like the Jell-O thing. It's really good, you guys. But some of it's not, at least to me, but I'm not, I guess, as acclimated to general, but it's a real thing. And part of what we always talk about is, how do we talk about food made by people of color? And we always act as if we talk about the food made by people of color in the right way, it will fix the whole problem, as if whiteness isn't a part of this equation. Mm-hmm. And I think I think that white America, especially in most of the West, is very afraid of recognizing whiteness, even in food. And we can joke about in-season chicken forever. It's one of my favorite things to do. But the truth is that we do have to look at whiteness, because I think it becomes very different when we say this person is taking white cuisine and mixing it with Mexican cuisine. Mm-hmm. This person is taking white cuisine and mixing it with Chinese cuisine. And people don't want to add that part. They want to just act like they're taking normal food and adding a little flair. But this is white culture. And if we ever want to break down the hierarchy, we have to actually recognize how much we've normalized whiteness and how much we've centered whiteness. It can't all be about the culture of color. It has to be also about the dominant culture that is shoving itself down everyone's throat and filtering everything and stealing everything. And it really is augmenting whiteness, seasoning whiteness, all of these things. And we have to be able to say that as well. So I would really love, because what we do now is we'll call it American, right? American cuisine. And all that does is further erase whiteness from the picture and further erase people of color. I am American. Yeah. And that means that your jollof rice is now American cuisine, right? So that's not what they're talking about. They're talking about hamburgers, and they're talking about, steaks, and they're talking about, white cuisine. Mm-hmm. And I think we also need to recognize that. I think part of the fear is it doesn't look that fancy when you start looking at it. But you know what? That's part of the whole colonization, right? Is instead of looking at what you have and looking at how deep does a culture go that just steals? Mm-hmm. Not very deep. So you have to stop looking at it, and you start calling it something else, and you start just pretending like it's a natural progression that you would take and take and take and take and take and make it yours, instead of asking, what did we really start with? Mm-hmm. And how much have we actually invested in that? And the answer is often not that much.
Right. Mm. It brings me back to one of the other words that I try not to use is elevate, right? Which means exactly what you were saying, is like marrying it with white food. But for some reason, that makes the value of it go up. Why is that? Right? Yeah. Because, you're assuming, right, to like dismantle, to be really nitpicky, because I'm a Virgo, I get really nitpicky. But like when you use the form elevate, right, you're starting from a position of up here. The food that you're elevating is here. And oftentimes we use that in reference to food from people of color. And by elevate, you mean you present it in ways that are really amenable to like fine French dining.
Yeah, and you take a lot of the seasoning out, you take a lot of the flavor out,
Right.
maybe take some unfamiliar ingredients out, you cut it in a funny shape.
You get the bone out of there.
Yeah.
Get rid of the tendon, the best part.
Yeah.
You take away what is the most interesting about it, I think. You assimilate it, and that's, and then I use that word intentionally because I think assimilation is also a part of this process, right? We do the same thing to food as what we want people to do here when we speak English, right? Remove your bones, remove all the parts that we don't like so that you can be a part of polite society.
And I feel like, it's funny because we were talking about ritual and culture and things that people would call, weird and strange. I find oftentimes that communities of color have far more in common food-wise than they ever have with white culture. And yet oftentimes when we look at this, it's always processed through whiteness. I know even when we would cook, because there's only 300,000 Nigerians in America, so there's not a lot of shops, there's almost no restaurants. My mom would always go to the Asian food supply because you could find a lot of very similar ingredients. You could find the stockfish, you could find the ground shrimp, you could find all of these things that you would need. You could even sometimes find certain yams and things that you couldn't find elsewhere to make pounded yam. And oftentimes I would have, if someone wanted to come over for dinner and it was like a Latinx friend of mine or an Asian friend of mine, I would always feel much more comfortable presenting authentic Nigerian food to them than I would to a white person, because they would always find something, right? You would leave the bone in, you would have your tripe in the stew, you would have all these things, but people would be like, oh, that, even if it's not their taste, they're like, that looks familiar. And I think it's interesting to me because I find oftentimes that when fusion is done within communities of color, it works oftentimes so much better because it's done by mutual appreciation and by actually seeing commonalities and that connection to the food and connection to these ingredients. And it's not how can we take this out, it's how can we find the things that we both really love about this and kind of create a shared table. And it's always interesting to me that difference of the product that comes out of, instead of kind of taking out some of the pieces of this cuisine that are oftentimes most revered by the communities that are creating it, you often find a celebration of what people would oftentimes think are the more difficult aspects to eat when communities of color come together to eat. And it has always interested me when I find that, because that's the type of fusion that I can get behind, right? That I love, because it's oftentimes I find more about solidarity and mutual appreciation than about exploitation. But it's always interesting when you think about what elevates and what doesn't, And the elevation to me always seemed we cut a bunch of spices and we cut any kind of animal parts that didn't seem, that weren't a breast or a thigh, and we added a bunch of butter. And that's usually the entire thing, regardless of whether the butter should be there or not, or we cut out all the butter because we decided there was entirely too much of it. I think it's always interesting when you see what creativity looks like when you're trying to actually come together for the most revered, from a culturally competent first-person experience with the food, how different that sort of fusion looks versus someone coming from the outside and just taking what appealed to them on first try. And also, food doesn't work that way. No. Even as a young kid, there's food that I love, Nigerian food I love, that I had to be forced to eat as a child. That every child I know had to be forced to eat. And then you grow to love it. I think we all have those things we didn't want to eat. We didn't want to eat certain vegetables, didn't want to eat that. Well, every culture has those things. And I never I hated bone marrow with a passion. And I had uncles that would take my bowl of stew and show me all of the marrow I left and watch me eat it. I thought I was going to die, And they're you have to learn to eat it. And now, of course, you can go to a French restaurant, right, and charge so much money for marrow bones. And I'm this? Really? Are you kidding me? But I think oftentimes we forget that a lot of white consumers of food from other cultures are young children coming to it. We're oh, gross, oh. But you have to build a taste for everything. It takes time. It takes repeated exposures. And you can't go on a vacation and learn to appreciate something in 2 days that oftentimes it takes children from that culture 5, 7, 15 years to fully appreciate. And it just always cracks me up because, we all see like food that, I know there's food my kids will go into, even just, quote unquote, like even white food, French food, all these things, there's things I know that right now they'd be like, oh, that's so disgusting. And part of growing is learning to have a taste for it. We forget, like we seem to think that, you can just hop into a culture and you have this sophisticated palate. You don't, you have a palate that's used to something. If it's not used to that culture, you're not going to fully appreciate the food.
And when you mentioned, sorry.
Go ahead. No.
Okay. Well, you mentioned creativity too, and I think a lot of communities of color globally have so much in common in their foodways because it's a lot of times if you are a colonized subject, the food that you have access to is garbage, literally the garbage of the colonizers, right? Pig head, the entrails, the parts that people just throw away when they can afford to eat the good stuff, right? And so the story of sisig in the Philippines is so interesting. It's like one of the national dishes, but it is literally created just from the leftover pig head from like the feasts that the Spanish would have. I felt so much resonance with that story because that's also the story of pho, the beef noodle soup where all you had was the bones of the cow and then you had to make something out of it, And so I think that's where we have a lot of commonality too. It takes so much more creativity to make something palatable out of a pig uterus than it does from a tenderloin, right? That's easy. You just sear it, right? But the uterus, you have to cook for a really long time, or season in a particular way, or you have to do something to make it not a uterus. I've just been thinking about that a lot today, that particular dish. And we have that in common, but we also have in common that we have often been the sources of exploitable food resources, like spices.
Yes.
And so there's that aspect, which has informed, I think, just patterns of colonization globally as well.
Yeah, and it also seems that whenever foods are appropriated in white culture, they remove all the context, and they also remove the parts that might challenge their identity, that might actually cause them to think, to not appreciate, but also to think about their complicity or to think about their own fear of difference or things like that.
Yeah, and oftentimes the story behind those more challenging ingredients is one of exploitation that people don't want to talk about, and it's always interesting to see when people will take a dish that might have had, what was left over, things like tripe, things like that, and, they'll make a mistake instead. But they don't want to, because they don't want to have that conversation oftentimes, even with themselves, as to why is tripe so prevalent in so many of these cultures? Why are all these things being used? Why are these low quality grains being processed over and over again, or the remnants of grain processing being used over and over again, instead of the heart of the grain? And so instead they'll say, oh, we took this and we updated it, and we used this instead. What if we took the seasoning that was used to make this really tough, almost unpalatable cut of meat edible, and we used it on, a sirloin? Oh, well then, we just made it easier for you. No, what you did was you tried to remove the conversation as to why for hundreds of years that was what people had to survive off of. And I think that a lot of times we try to avoid those sorts of conversations, and people want to just see the end result. And so much of exploitation, especially appropriation, is people who want to enjoy the spoils of the, not even just creativity, but the survival of communities of color, the things that you do to stay human and to have community and to have nutrition that recognizes your humanity. All of these things that we do in a system that doesn't want us to have all of that, and people then just come and go, oh well, good job, I'll take that, and kind of take it, and they want to open a restaurant with it, and don't want to have a conversation as to why it had to be so creative, why it had to have so many steps, why this, certain, why there was so much labor involved in this, why these ingredients, why, it's, people act like it's magic. They found this, simple grain and turned it into this, and even
They had no choice.
yeah, and I remember in the old days when people would talk about flank steak, and they would be like, oh, it's this really inexpensive cut of meat that's very tough, but If you season it this particular way, cut it this particular way, cook it for this long, then you'll get this beautiful cut of meat like people in Central and South America do. And then now you can't afford flank steak, right? And no one talked about the fact that, those were the cuts of meat that were left. And even that was kind of a luxury. It wasn't an everyday. And that people worked with that. And that's why it was cheap. And it was popular in communities because it was what could be afforded in communities. And now, not even that is affordable. So then, okay, what's the next thing that's going to be taken and divorced from its history, and the price will go up, and then the communities that created and nurtured it won't be able to afford it anymore.
Yeah, that makes me remember that Whole Foods campaign, collards are the new kale. Do you remember that? It's so funny. Just like everything inherent in that, like blank is the new blank. You're comparing these things, and there is like documented data on the fact that like when a food becomes a superfood or becomes popular in that way, the price goes up, right? The demand goes up, and that would in turn, like you're saying, just keep it from those communities, like restrict their access to it when they've become like used to getting it. Like that's an important part of the diet, right? So for collards to become gentrified in that way, as Mickey Kendall put it, would have so many outsized effects on people.
I've had some gritty, sandy, gentrified collards. Let me tell you, you'll need to put some more work into that before you start putting it in restaurants, because no one's washing their collards enough. No one is.
The Pioneer Woman's recipe for collards is 15 minutes.
It takes at least 15 minutes to wash them.
Right?
That's...
So I think that, do we have cards going around? What are we on time? Okay, let's go ahead and collect the cards so that there's an opportunity for you all to ask questions. While they're doing that, I'll just ask one quick reflection so that we're not just silent up here while people are handing in their cards. So the question I wanted to ask pertains to an exhibit that's actually here by Carrie Mae Weems called the Kitchen Table Series, which offers meditation on domesticity, family relationships, the intersections of class, race, and gender, all through black and white prints of the home kitchen table. So as you can see behind us here. And so what I'm interested in about this is why explore the sort of personal and the political through the kitchen table rather than through like the bedroom or something like that? What is it unique about the kitchen table that can sort of speak to a lot of the issues about race, class, gender, identity, community, family?
I mean, I think there's a lot in it. Who sits where, what you're eating. You have multiple ages and genders at a table, and there's so much power dynamic as to even who gets to sit at the table or not, whether you're looking at each other, whether you're talking to each other. So much of our life revolves around food, getting food, preparing food, and enjoying food. And oftentimes the discussions we have are so culturally telling as to whether we're having a discussion about kids looking at their phones at the table, or whether we're having a discussion about, women who spend all day cooking and then are too exhausted to enjoy the meal, or know they have to get up and wash all the dishes afterwards, or whether or not it's a man who sits at the head of the table, or what it means when a man's missing from the head of the table, or all these sort of discussions we have all come around that one space where we're supposed to congregate together. And so I think that a lot of the way in which we think about the way we structure society and families, you can see a lot by how you sit at a table.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I mean, I have so many friends who've come out to their family at the kitchen table, right? It is the place where you have those conversations, and it's sort of like in an ideal situation, right? That is where you have mandated family FaceTime. The absence of it is also really significant, right? Like my family rarely ate at the kitchen table because we were all just like zipping in and out of our apartment because my mom was working all the time. And so, I would eat like over the garbage can. I was one of those kids. I guess I never really aged out of that either. I still do that. But, that is a part of how you pick up on social cues as a child. And of course it extends to your adulthood. That's what informs your interactions there. It makes me think of Moonlight, too. Like a lot of the film Moonlight, features a lot of great kitchen table scenes, too. just a lot of wonderful conversations and dynamics. And, there's a lack of coercion at that table between the main character and his sort of family, adopted family. And, they're so significant. There's such significant scenes in that film.
By the way, that's also just a great filmmaker's cheat, because you can set people at a table and see both of their faces and reactions for tough discussions. And I think sometimes I wonder how many times our idea of having discussions at the dinner table has been influenced by film having these discussions, and whether or not, because I know a lot of times you'll see, I just finished making a film, that's why I've been thinking about this, where people will we'll have this discussion at a table, and they'll either have it at a boardroom meeting, or they'll have it sitting at a kitchen table, but it's a really good way to get everyone there. And I always wonder if it's chicken or the egg. Did we always have tough discussions at the table before film set these up and found out it's a really good way to get everyone's reaction in one shot? Or did we set it up, afterwards? Or was it, influenced by the fact that we were having those discussions? But no matter what, it's what we're stuck with. But it's just a really good way to get your shot in any aspiring filmmakers out there.
Oh, that's a fascinating take. I never even thought of it that way. Huh.
Should we go ahead and turn it over to audience questions?
All right, thanks everyone for submitting your questions. I'll try to get to just a few of them. I don't think I'll be able to get to all of them. So the first question here, what role do you see gardens playing in dismantling racism in food systems, or does gardening contribute to or reinforce racism? Thanks for your thoughts.
Gardening, oh wow. Well, let's see. My first thought is just the many urban garden programs that exist in the United States in major cities, especially in Oakland, where that is so much a part of food sovereignty. Teaching people what food looks like coming out of the ground also is really an important part of it, and just having a community space for people to just hang out in and talk and just do some fun labor together. So there's that aspect to it. I think there's so many ways they can be used, though. They can be weaponized also. When you think about zoning and neighborhood zoning, they can be used to gentrify neighborhoods as well. And so I'm thinking in terms of community gardens, but I know that there are so many other, there's so many types of gardens.
I know when I was a kid, for a while we lived next to a community garden. It was literally the only access to fresh vegetables we had, because I grew up incredibly poor. But I think that it can be wonderful, and I think that many communities of color have built their own community spaces. But I think, especially when we look at issues around gentrification and the increase in land prices and access to land in local communities, those vacant lots, that space that's required, and even home ownership in general for communities of color, or any of the, anywhere that would create these spaces, are rapidly disappearing. And then sometimes you'll get this weird government community space, and it's just this gross piece of unfarmable land that's only there for a while until they can make money, right? A lot of times it'll be a neighborhood that's kind of on a downturn, and then they're like, oh, we have this extra space, we'll turn it into a community land until the prices rise again, and then the space will go along with the housing and everything else. I think that it matters, but I think that also it is not sustainable when we look at what's going to help communities. I think that the amount of labor it takes to grow and maintain that sort of land is also, that time is something that communities of color have less access to than a lot of other communities. Getting out and garden requires that you have time during the day to get out and work this land, and that takes money and resources as well. And the truth is that a lot of communities that would need that produce the most actually really, they have to work. And a lot of the money and resources that's going to these things, oftentimes because white people in power think it's cute or quaint, should be going to a grocery store or to a school lunch program, or a Head Start lunch program, or a community breakfast program that would give much more sustainable food. I think it's also really important to look at that when we talk about community gardening, we're also talking about labor-intensive food as far as cooking. And we like to have these notions that if communities of color just had more fresh vegetables, that their life would be healthier and happier, and how can we get them a garden that they can dig carrots from the soil and then all their problems would be solved. But the truth is that when you're working 14, 16 hours a day, chopping a bunch of vegetables, cooking them down, is not an easy or good or productive way to feed your family. And we need to look at accessible food choices that actually fit the lifestyle for many disenfranchised communities that have less time to put into, this. If I find the people who are like, I pull this fresh from my garden, are oftentimes like people who can afford to work less or take long holidays or have someone else dig them out from the garden for them. But all of the labor, just even in food prep, is something that I think we need to look at when we look at how more often communities of color are working hard, are taking care of oftentimes larger families as well. And so you're talking about chopping vegetables for 5 kids maybe, not 1 kid, or the half a kid right now that I think like white American families are having right now. And so I think we need to look at, instead of romanticizing like what communities of color had to do to survive in the past, look at the way that people are living now and try to provide easy access to healthy food for communities of color.
Let's move on to another question. One of the things you both brought up was that it's great to sustain and support those spaces that respect and promote diverse food. How can low-income or non-affluent people of color who want to but can't financially support those places consistently help with this endeavor?
I think that there's so many different roles that we play. Like, if your power in this world is not buying power, then I would not worry about it, honestly. Like, that solution is mainly for people who can afford to spread like the privilege that they have around and like redistribute it a little bit. So if you don't come from that position, then like I think your level of complicity with like white supremacy in the restaurant world or in the food world or like the food system is just different. It's like complicated in a different way.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to try to catch food producers on the come up, right? Everyone has their starting point in their community,
right?
And they only get further ahead by support from the community. And so organizing that, a lot of times it's about numbers. It's about your next big gathering. It's about where your community goes, even on that one special night out, where you're having your birthday dinner. And also getting the word out, right? And sharing information about these local spots. That matters a lot. And then I also think it's about looking politically at the zoning in your area, looking at what restaurants are coming and if they're displacing other businesses, looking at new building projects and whether or not they are allocating space for the community that's there instead of the community they want to replace that community. A lot of times where I've found a lot of power, especially like in a place that's rapidly gentrifying like Seattle, is communities of color basically saying, no, you know what, a certain percentage of this new project needs to go to businesses of color, right? And we may not have the money to start those businesses or to shop every day at those businesses, but we're going to stand outside your door until you promise that you're going to put the focus there. And so we've had like some recent building projects where, every business is owned by people of color and like half are women of color. And that was primarily won by the protests of people who honestly don't eat out that much, can't afford to eat out very much. But that meant so much more than stopping by for a meal occasionally, right? Like getting that space, getting those rental agreements, those long-term leases, affordable rates, and all those things that normally, people of color don't have access to. So I would say if you don't have the money, look for the politics. And if you have that leverage politically and you have the leverage to get your friends and community members in politically, start looking at things like zoning and start looking at things like these new projects and where they're going to and who's being invested in, who's not. Look at who's getting into cooking programs and who's not. And also actively work to see that your community isn't a place for food establishments that cut out communities of color, that refuse to pay living wages to people of color, that don't cater to patrons of color, that do exploit the traditional food of communities of color. Like it's two ways, right? One is saying, no, this isn't welcome here, and we need more of this. And I think there's always something we can do, and I do believe, like you said, the burden should not be on communities of color. But if you want to do something and you're sitting there going, look, I can't economically sustain them, you can politically do something. And I've seen it happen, and it can work.
Yeah, I would say like buying power is important, but it's not everything. There's so many other things you can do. A lot of, I've done a lot of like writing about like food justice when I was on food stamps. Like I cared about that stuff. I couldn't go to restaurants, but I did want to talk about it. So even having those conversations, either verbally or through writing or through social media or whatever, that's so important too.
Yeah, and I know I was listening to some thing on NPR, and they were talking about long-term activists who've worked for a very long time in various social activism projects, and they basically say, if you have the money, use your money, and if all you have is time, use your time. And so you use what you have. And so I think a lot of the problem that happen is people who have a lot of money think they can not put any of their money behind it and just share a couple Facebook posts. And what that really does is take up space and time and opportunity that people who only have their voice can use. Right? And I would rather see people who know the community, who know exactly what the community needs, being the people out, being the voices of things, and voicing what they need, and then the people who have the money to back that up. So what you have that's the most powerful, use it. And so for some of you, that will be your money, and be very conscious where you put your money. Some of you, it will be your voice. Some of you, it will be your vote. Use it appropriately.
All right. For the sake of time, I'm going to just do one more question, and this is a huge question. So I'll ask maybe if you can kind of select, in a nutshell, what you would say about gender's role in the food discussion. What's maybe one thing you would point to as an important thing to think about when it comes to gender and food?
Oh man. I would say that there is a lot of gendered violence in the food system as it exists. There's so many ways in which that manifests. In restaurant kitchens, right, there's sexual harassment, which I've experienced too, working in kitchens. There is a lack of just respect for women in professional kitchens. In agriculture, there's a lot of sexual assault that just goes unpunished. Even in the coffee world, right, coffee buyers who go to the tropics, sometimes frequently engage in sex tourism and exploit the local populations. So there's so much that's rolled up in there too that is based on like gendered violence.
Mm-hmm. And I'd say we definitely need to look at that and combat it and look at where our money goes. So many of these famous chefs that we love on Food Network or whatever have been, ass grabbing for years and getting rich anyway. And that we need to look at how much of that we're financing by the decisions we make. I also think we need to look at like the kitchen table and look at how much is robbed from women by the expectations that they will be the people who spend this time cooking and preparing, how much productivity, how many earnings are left. I mean, I'm a single parent, and it was known that as the single parent, I would be the parent, right? And it also meant that there were hours I couldn't work. There were promotions I couldn't go for because I had to be home and preparing. And all around the world, that is an issue that matters. And actually, my brother was trying to convince me to go back to Nigeria to spend time with the family, and he was like, no, it's so great, I mean, it's like he went in a very politically tough time. So you weren't really allowed to leave the house because there was a lot of violence happening. He's like, no, you just sit with the family, you chat, you have a beer. And I'm like, no, you sit with the family and chat and have a beer. I would be in the kitchen the whole time, and that's not my idea of a good time. I'm gonna wait until you can leave the house. Because I don't wanna do that, right? And those gendered roles, though, are everywhere, and they are prevalent internationally, not just overseas, but also here. And, it was always assumed that I would be the one home cooking, and that if I worked more, my children were going to miss out because somehow they would just starve to death because no one else knew how to cook. And even when I was married, there was that idea that they were missing out on this experience. And so I think even like domestically, it is not only like time, but it's also like money and resources. It is part of that unpaid labor that's pushed upon women. Whereas if you're a male chef, you're expected to make your riches if you're good at this. And even if you're a dad, you're expected to, at least get some sexual favors for making dinner. And all you did was like burn some, rice. And, that weird thing of like, there was a skit I saw, I can't remember what show, where like a dad brought cupcakes in and became the most popular like person in the school. And the teacher was like, he's a dad and he made cupcakes. And like, then he started competing with the other dad for all of the attention, for all of the staff, and all, for being the dad that dared. And all these women every day have been like bringing in everything, and they're just like, "Are you kidding me?" But I feel like a lot of times, yeah, it really is. And so I think it's such a reflection of so much of the way in which who we value, who we don't value in our society, and I think that really matters. And I think that we steal so much, we devalue so much food, and we devalue the making of food primarily, I think, because we view it as something that women do. And it's just another way in which we devalue women, and another way in which we lock women into cycles of poverty, and we disempower women who work in these traditional fields or do the very important work of providing for family members. We use it to further lock them away from any sort of power or opportunity. And so we definitely need to look at that whole thing and how we think of home as your mom cooking or your grandma cooking. I have 2 sons, and someone's gonna have to learn to cook because they're gonna starve, But also, I don't want them to think that one day they'll get a wife that's gonna do these things. And I want them to value, but I also want them to really value the work I do. I want them to understand that I'm working and then I'm taking the time to do this, and this is more work, and it's not just to be expected because I'm mom,
And that comes back to the ethics, and I've been asked this question a lot as a critic, of going to a restaurant where the owner or the chef has committed like sexual assault or harassment or done these things against people at their establishment. And how much, it comes down to this question of like, how much do you value the people who've been victimized?
Yeah.
Right? Like, is this chicken worth it? Yeah. That's the question that they ask on this like unconscious level a lot, right? Like, one of the things that surprised me was about this like post Me Too like moment in restaurants, which I think still needs to happen. I think it's still in the process because there's so many things that we need to fix in the restaurant world. But the restaurants where people have come out as saying, like Mario Batali, like did this or that, or like this person did this or that, they're still popular. Like people still go to them. And those people have struck that bargain, in their own heads, unconsciously or not, just to say like, actually this pasta is worth it.
And it's also like not even just, is the pasta worth it, but what do you think the women who are being harassed could create? And what do you think they're possibly worth? A lot of these are aspiring chefs who are forced out of the business due to this harassment. And so it's not only the value of this chicken, but it's that you valued the potential of all of these women less than this chicken, right? And the chicken's just chicken. It just talks about how little, and so often like in the arts, even in the writing world, where we have these discussions, is it worth it? Oh, he makes these great things, blah, blah, blah. And no one stops to think, what are you saying about the potential of all of these women that were harmed? And so many, like, you can't just become a chef. You have to work your way up. And so many women are forced out along the way. And so many chefs of color are forced out along the way. And we always think that this one thing by this chef is worth it. This white male chef is worth it. And we don't pause and think, oh my gosh, what could we have had from all of these other people that were forced out at the beginning of their careers because they didn't want to put up with the harassment? Or even just what could they have created, even if they make it through, if they didn't have to constantly fight that, if they didn't have to use so much energy to work around this sort of abuse. Like, a creative field requires that sort of concentration and freedom that oftentimes that creators of color and female creators are not allowed in these harassing environments. So it's not even just, do we love that chicken that much? It's, do we love female creators that little?
Right. And because only men, or like only white men, can be geniuses.
Yes. And if we had a problem that was stopping white men from creating, I mean, even the thought of one of them of us not going to one of his restaurants anymore puts us up in arms, right? So if this was an issue that was suddenly like, young white men are being forced out of the industry, we'd find a solution.
It'd be a crisis.
Right? It would be a
Right,
complete,
yeah.
like literally, like 5 white guys lose their jobs for harassment, and we're like,
It's a witch hunt.
oh,
Yeah.
what's it like to be a white man in America today? You don't know what to do. And it's literally like, this dude was harassing women, horrifically for 10 years. And people are like, now I don't know what to do. And it's like, how about not that?
Yeah.
How about you just not do that?
Thank you guys so much. Everyone has to go home in the snow, and so we're going to let everyone head home. And thank you so much for bringing so many insightful comments. I appreciated this. I loved it. I hope everyone enjoyed it. Something to think about the next time you have a meal. So thank you for coming. Let's give one more round of applause for our guests.